Hello again. Jeff Wall has been a member of the violin section of London Symphonia, Orchestra London, and the London Symphony Orchestra for 38 years. And this year, he's retiring. Jeff is not so much of a video interview kind of guy, so I thought that in honor of his retirement, I'd share a few highlights with you of his long and rewarding career. Jeff joined the London Sinfonia, now that spelling is Sinfonia, in 1975. At that time, this was the professional corps of London's orchestra, known at the time as the London Symphony Orchestra. This newly formed group was designed by conductor Alexis Hauser, and this was pre-internet, and having another London Symphony Orchestra across the pond wasn't quite as confusing then. In London, this was Jeff's first job, his very first gig. After 4 years performing, there were financial difficulties with the orchestra, and Jeff left for Toronto for 8 years to freelance as a violinist. Over that time, he performed with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet Orchestra, the National Ballet Orchestra, the Hamilton Philharmonic, and the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony Orchestra. He met his future wife, Lois, in a master class in Banff in 1975. Lois is a pianist who was also a Western student. They got married in 1981. A job came open again with the orchestra, now renamed Orchestra London. This was 1987. Joe Lanza auditioned the same day for the concertmaster chair, and Joe got the job in the morning, and Jeff got the section violin job in the afternoon. He's been here ever since. Jeff is an amazing writer. When I first started producing concerts for We Play On and later London Symphonia, I was aware that Jeff had written program notes, but I didn't know that they were full of so much humor and incredible personal flair. At first I thought, maybe we should modify this or that or reduce some words to try to squeeze it into the audience program. But I quickly realized that the program notes that Jeff produced were really a beautiful work of art, and they didn't benefit from being shortened. When the radio presenter Tom Allen joined us to narrate a concert a few years ago, he read what Jeff had written in the program notes, and he really liked them. He remarked how fabulous and entertaining that they were. I'm going to switch over now and read some of Jeff's own descriptions, first about his writing program notes, and after that about his very first concert with the London Symphony Orchestra. A note about notes. In October 1996, I obtained a house program for our OLC season opening concert with the intention of reading the program notes. There weren't any. The annotator had quit. When I made inquiries, it seemed that there was no plan for a replacement. I found this an intolerable situation for a professional orchestra, which, after all, must rely to some degree on a knowledgeable public for its support. And so, somewhat rashly, I volunteered my services. No one tried to stop me. I had the advantages of a degree in music history and a seat on the orchestra's program and artists committee, which let me in on the selection process of the particular pieces to be performed. It also gave me an opportunity to get some of my favorite music played. I had some hesitancy over the necessary loss of practice time involved, but as my services were only required for the Masterworks series, I could ease into the job. My goals were to try to convey to an interested listener why and how the composer came to write his piece and why we wanted to play it, and do so in a manner that would keep the listener reading. I took my cue from George Bernard Shaw's boast during his days as a music critic, that he could make a deaf stockbroker read his column on music every week. I don't claim that level of success, but the positive reception received over 22 years has been gratifying. Nota bene, I guess. My first concert with London Symphony Orchestra, as it was then called, on September 17th, 1975, a fine Wednesday evening, was also the very first concert by its newly minted corps, London Sinfonia. As it happened, the London Transit Commission was in the middle of an operator's strike, and so I left my apartment on Richmond Street north of the University Gate early, with the intention of walking to Centennial Hall. It's not a short walk, especially if you're carrying a violin and a suit bag full of tails and shoes, and after a block I did something I had never done before. I stuck out my thumb. Much to my amazement, a driver pulled over almost immediately, and a short time later I was walking cheerfully across sunlit Victoria Park toward the beginning of my career. And then I looked down, and between my violin case on one hand and suit bag in the other, I saw to my horror yellow socks. Bad enough, although this was the 1970s, not a high point in the history of fashion, but I realized instantly that I had not packed any regulation black socks, and that wearing yellow socks under concert dress would not enhance either the impression the orchestra would make on the audience or the one I would make on my new employers. And so, in a panic, I ran, fiddle and bag bouncing wildly, back to Richmond Street, and again thrust out my thumb. To no avail. With churning stomach, I backed slowly from Central Avenue to Pall Mall and over the tracks toward Oxford, apparently either invisible or inimical to the northbound stream of traffic, as my pre-concert cushion of time was evaporating. But at last, a car slowed and stopped just a few yards up the block. I lumbered as quickly as I could under my load and flopped panting into the front seat with a heartfelt, "Thank you so much." And as I began to explain my predicament, I stared into the startled face of a woman who had just stopped to buy some cigarettes at the convenience store. Well, I was, nonplussed, chagrined, actually mortified, but as I apologized hastily and profusely and started to get out, she took pity on me and, realizing that I wasn't a carjacker or a crackpot, drove me back to Richmond, where I picked up my socks, literally, if not figuratively, and called a cab. I was not the only person in need of a taxi at the height of the bus strike, however, and by the time the car arrived and dropped me at the hall, my heart was in my mouth. At this point, I discovered that Centennial Hall had no dressing rooms, and so at 5 minutes to 8 o'clock, the stragglers in the men's room in the basement were treated to the sight of a crazed kid in yellow socks tearing into a stall with a penguin suit in hand. Somehow I jumped into it and got into the opposite side of the stage. With the oboes A already sounding and the concertmaster standing at the front, I scuttled to my place at the back of the second violins, puffing and perspiring like a beer league defenseman, and with my bow arm shaking like a leaf, I tuned the violin to my stand partner's A string. It was not an auspicious beginning. I no longer have the socks. Jeff, thank you so much for landing in and staying in London for so many years and for entertaining so many Londoners with your music and your writing. Happy retirement.